Thanks very much. So I want to start out by giving you a little bit of the context for the ideas that I'm going to talk about today. So the background to this work is some previous work that I did with Stephen French regarding the attitudes that naturalistic metaphysicians such as ourselves should take towards a prioristic or analytic metaphysics. Now, what prompted this work was a wave of criticism coming from within the discipline, coming from within philosophy of science, philosophy of physics in particular, and spearheaded by James Ladyman, according to which the majority of the work that was being done in metaphysics was perceived as variously childish, trivial, vacuous, navel-gazing, and most importantly, taking that it took place within a scientific vacuum. And since it seemed that sort of, okay, thank you. So since it seemed that sort of making snarky comments about analytic metaphysicians had become a bit of a sort of icebreaker, a bit of a sort of conversation piece at the BSPS conference every year, back then it seemed that we should sit down and try and figure out where we ourselves stood with respect to those criticisms. So in the work that we wrote, called Thinking Outside the Toolbox, and then a later descendant of it, we sort of settled on what seemed to be a kind of double-edged claim. So on the one hand, we were broadly in agreement with the spirit of those criticisms, right? As naturalists, we absolutely agreed that metaphysics doesn't make any sense to us as a discipline if it, considers itself as a sort of satellite discipline that doesn't hook up with anything else that goes on in the university, right? It doesn't hook up with other things that go on in science. So that much seemed clear. Nevertheless, we did feel a little bit uncomfortable with the unqualified nature of a lot of the claims that were being made in that critical literature. And in particular, we felt that if you look at how naturalistic metaphysics is actually done in practice, then what you see a lot of going on is naturalistic metaphysicians looking to analytic metaphysics, reading the books, looking at the journals, going to the talks, and then appropriating that stuff, sort of using and abusing it for their own purposes in their own attempt to create a naturalistic metaphysics, right? To create a metaphysical understanding of science. And we felt that when you acknowledge that fact, right, that analytic metaphysics often functions as a sort of a tool or a heuristic for philosophers of science, right, to create their own theories, then it becomes quite difficult to blithely maintain that just none of it has any value, right, because some of it has served that function. Okay, so that was sort of the claim that we made. Now, since we went live with that work, right, a number of criticisms have been levied against us. So the first of these criticisms was that if it was our intention to be sort of broadly complicit in this shaming of analytic metaphysics, but nevertheless sort of draw back from the more extreme claims, right, give it a sort of humanizing discount, then we failed. Because really the defense that we gave of analytic metaphysics, this kind of heuristic defense in which it could potentially be used to help us make sense of science in the future, is just too permissive. Right? Anything could serve that function, right? You can use doctor's use to help you understand what's going on in quantum mechanics. Anything could have that function. So it seemed that by citing this, we completely disarmed ourselves of any ability to criticize what was going on, right? The trends in analytic metaphysics. And we took that as a bit of a reductio of what we ourselves understood ourselves to be doing. Now, the other criticism that was made was that while these facts that we cited about how naturalistic metaphysics is done in practice are presumably somehow relevant to this discussion, they're not in themselves very insightful. And in particular, they don't tell us anything, it seems, or at least prima facie, about the relationship that naturalistic metaphysics bears, and bears in principle, to a priori inquiry, right? As opposed to maybe just telling us a bunch of what might be contingent facts about naturalistic metaphysicians and how we happen to do things. Okay, so really, it seemed that the other side of our claim, the sort of pro-metaphysics side, if you like, was just as it stood, quite ambiguous. So without saying much more about that work that Stephen and I did, or the way that we ended up sort of responding to those criticisms, basically what I want to do for you today is to offer you better arguments for a broadly similar, but hopefully less ambiguous conclusion. So what I want to argue today is that absolutely yes, Laurie et al. Are right that metaphysics does need to put science back at the centre of it. But that doesn't in itself mean that a prioristic methods, the same sort of methods that analytic metaphysicians use, are nevertheless indispensable in producing naturalistic metaphysics and doing philosophy of science. Okay, that's what I want to say. So in outline, the first part of the talk, what I'm going to do is just give a quick review of some of these criticisms that have been made of analytic metaphysics. And then in part two, I want to sort of further substantiate this idea that science really is central to metaphysics, or it should be. And the way I'm going to do that is by looking at two conceptions of metaphysics that a couple of contemporary metaphysicians have offered, right, or how it is that they think about their field. So one of the sort of nice things that has come out of this whole episode is that by putting metaphysicians on the back foot, a lot of them have come forward and really tried to better articulate the nature of the enterprise that they take themselves to be engaging in. Right? And that's a good thing, I think. So whatever you might think of some of the things that James Laurie said, I think you can give it this kind of perfectionist sort of defense, if you like. Right? Some good stuff has come out of it. Nevertheless, I want to show in part three that it doesn't follow from that there isn't anything that we might want to do in metaphysics. Indeed, it doesn't follow that there might not be anything that we want to do in what looks to be, like philosophy of physics or the metaphysics of physics, that can never, it's not clear that all of it can be informed by science in some sort of meaningful way. And actually what I want to do is use a case study looking at, just very quickly, some themes in the metaphysics of fundamentality to show us that lots of philosophers of physics are having to rely on exactly the same sorts of methods that analytic metaphysicians are getting it in the neck from philosophers of physics. Okay? And I'll basically leave it there. I'm not going to try and draw general conclusions from this. I'm not going to try and delimit for you what the limits of scientific metaphysics are, but hopefully there'll be stuff that we can talk about the relationship between science and metaphysics, which is obviously the thing for the conference. Okay, so let's get to this critical background here. So these criticisms that philosophers of physics have made or philosophers in general have made of analytic metaphysics are sort of all over the place. So Tim Maudlin, for example, has done some nice stuff. Hugh Price, Craig Callender, Michael Dummett wrote about this shortly before he died in a nice piece. But the classic statement of the view is without doubt chapter 1 of Lady Moon and Rossi's book, Everything Must Go. Okay, so what they say in that book is that one of the main contentions of that work is that contemporary analytic metaphysics, a professional activity engaged in by some extremely intelligent and morally serious people, fails to qualify as part of the enlightened pursuit of objective truth and should be discontinued. Okay? So if you look through that chapter and some of these other works, you can find sort of numerous grounds for complaints, of which I'll mention just a few. So the first of these complaints is that analytic metaphysics seems to have this deeply frivolous character, right? So if you were to leaf through a handful of recent works in the literature, then you would soon find yourself on trips to other possible worlds populated by zombies, spirits, unicorns, dragons, trout turkeys, writer cucumbers, dumped steers, and in a kind of chummy and joke, the mereological fusion of David Lewis and a talking donkey. Okay? So, even presumably the most unrepentant of analytic metaphysicians is presumably going to admit that it at least sort of looks bad that this sort of stuff is the kind of paraphernalia of the discipline. This is the sort of stock in trade of metaphysicians today. And of course you might say that if you were to go and look at a bunch of philosophy of science, then you find things like demons sort of slamming doors open and shut, and people with electron microscope eyes. But there's a feeling there, or it seems to be the case, that in those contexts, that stuff is merely being cited to illustrate a thesis that could perfectly well be stated without it, right? In these contexts, on the other hand, the idea that a gump steer or a zombie is somehow very much a real possibility often does essential work in the arguments, right, in which they're cited, since, as we'll see in a moment, the very possibility is often taken to refute a rival thesis. Okay? So as such, taking these kind of preposterous entities very much ontologically seriously seems to be crucial, as we'll see, can be crucial in the analytic context, and that is, it seems, at least prima facie a problem. Another criticism that's been levied is that metaphysics relies too much on intuition training to justify its claims, rather than coherence with anything outside of itself. So this is something you can really see in the debate over Peter Van Inwagen's special composition question, right? Which is when he asks himself, what are the general conditions under which we can take sort of two objects and have them form a third object, namely a composite sort of composed of those things? And in thinking about the answer to this question, Van Inwagen considers such operations as stitching, gluing them together, or making them contiguous. And in each case reports that his intuitions tell against regarding the resultant putative composite as a bona fide object. Right? And it really is that act of sort of rolling his eyes back in his head and consulting his intuitions that does sort of the lion's share of the work in arguing for his seemingly radical conclusion that actually there are no composites, or at least there are no composites that aren't living things. Right? So that for him, the only things that exist are atoms and organisms. Okay? Now I should say that, you know, not everybody buys into this conclusion, very few people do, in particular Ted Sider doesn't. And the grounds that Sider has cited for not believing this is that for him, in his opinion, surely there is a gunk world in which some gunk is shaped into a giant sphere, and another where some gunk has the shape of a cube. And since gunk is by definition sort of matter that doesn't bottom out into fundamental parts, it's going to follow from this that there are these objects that are neither atoms nor organisms, and as such, Van Inwagen's thesis is false. Okay, so what you can see here is that Ted Sider is using his intuitions to counter Van Inwagen's intuitions, and that is just the basic sort of dialectic of the argument. So, you know, you can see that this is a problem where it seems, right? So seeing as, you know, God is dead, right, in philosophy, it seems that there's no reason to think these days why these intuitions that we might have, no matter how clear and distinct they might appear to us, it's not clear why we should think that they have evidential import. And even if we do think they have evidential import, what is certainly the case is that we lack any means of deciding whether one guy's intuitions have more evidential weight than another guy's intuitions, right? We certainly don't have a theory of that. And so it seems that, you know, this sort of, that kind of reliance on intuition in metaphysics to justify the claims is another very, very problematic aspect of it. Now, the third criticism I'll mention, and what's in some ways the most important for our purposes, is that metaphysics has become altogether too domesticated. So, it's been a kind of curious feature of metaphysics in that over a period sort of roughly contemporaneous in which metaphysics became largely decoupled from science, metaphysicians have become increasingly preoccupied with what they take to be the ontologically fundamental. Okay, so if you look in the sort of metaphysics, contemporary sort of metaphysics literature, you can find assertions, for example, about what the fundamental level of the world is like that do a lot of work. In particular, Lewis's assertion that the fundamental level separates itself out into a sort of mosaic of local matters of fact. And you can also find these whole debates, like these whole paper chases, concerning how we should think of the fundamental building blocks of matter, and in particular whether we should think of them as pointy, or in Nick Marcosian's words, maximally continuous extended simples, like these little tiny bits of plasticine. Okay, but famously in the first case, as Tim Modlin has made a big, really sort of pressed home, this claim that David Lewis makes about what the fundamental level is like is just asserted, like quantum mechanics never happened. And this debate over the fundamental building blocks and what they're like takes place in a completely a priori fashion, and as if the debate between Democritus and Anaxagoras remains the model for thinking about these issues in the 21st century. Okay, so it seems in both of these cases, what's happening is that the fundamental regimes of the world are being presented as this sort of doll's house version of the world of everyday experience, when everybody knows really that the scientific image of the world seems to be radically different. And it seems that even a sort of picking up, a passing acquaintance with a new scientist in a doctor's surgery would suffice to have kind of informed you of that. So as a result of these kind of criticisms that led Lehman and Ross to claim that mainstream contemporary analytic metaphysics has, like the 19th century metaphysics against which Russell revolted, become almost entirely a priori. Metaphysics informed by real physics is much less common. And it's on these grounds that they say it is to be discontinued, right? And that's their term. So this is obviously fighting talk, right? It's not nice to speak about the work of the vast majority of your colleagues as something that isn't worth doing, right? It's something that should be discontinued. And as I said, while Stephen and I were kind of broadly in support with the spirit of this critique, we did nevertheless have a feeling that there might be a bit of a curse on both our houses happening here, right? And that we had a feeling that even metaphysicians like James Ladyman, like ourselves, who want to interpret physics, are going to have to, in some cases, rely on these same kind of methods, right, that analytic metaphysicians do. And that's what I want to argue in what follows. So what I want to do, first of all, is to try, I'm going to argue, first of all, for this sort of like, for Ladyman's side of the argument, right, for the sort of the pro-naturalism claim, that there's something really is sort of rotten at the heart of metaphysics, okay? And so try and argue that metaphysics really does need to put science back in the center. Now, as I said, one of the nice things about the sort of fallout of this whole episode is that it's prompted metaphysicians to try and better define for us what they think metaphysics is. Okay, presumably part of the motivation for doing that is that by defining it accordingly, they can show that some of the criticisms that have been made of it are misdirected in some way. So today I want to look just briefly at two of these conceptions that you can find in the literature. The first of these conceptions is Laurie Halse's conception of metaphysics as somehow a much more general discipline than science is. Now I should say that of course it's not only Laurie Halse that thinks of metaphysics in this way. So for example, Adrian Moore just wrote this magnum opus, right, called The Evolution of Modern Metaphysics, in which he basically argues over 1,300 pages that historically metaphysics has been the most general attempt to make sense of things. Okay, so plenty of other people see metaphysics this way too, but I'm going to focus on Laurie Halse's presentation, okay, because it's like 10 pages or something. And then the other conception of metaphysics that I'm going to look at is this increasingly sort of popular one, according to which metaphysics is the science of the possible. So E.G. Lowe, the late E.G. Lowe is behind this, Ted Sider is behind this as well. Okay. So the basic idea here seems to be, as we will see, that because metaphysics is interested in what's possible, not really what's actual, that it is concerned with generalities and not the specifics of things. This is supposed to mean that science can somehow either be ignored or sort of brushed to the sidelines somehow. And what I want to argue is that that conclusion, if this is how we think about metaphysics, then that conclusion doesn't follow. Right? What I want to argue is that, in fact, meaningful engagement with science is actually crucial to the success of both of these projects so conceived. We'll start with Laurie Halse. So this stuff by Laurie Halse comes out in her paper, Metaphysics as Modeling, The Handmaid's Tale, and she's explicitly responding to these criticisms. So it's in a journal which is a sort of a dialogue with James Ladyman. Here's what she says. Why do contemporary metaphysics? Why rely on metaphysical reflection to develop theories about the world? Critics argue that contemporary metaphysics attempts to do the hard work of science from the ease of the armchair. But physics, not metaphysics, tells us about the fundamental nature of the world. At best, metaphysics is a handmaiden to science. To the uninitiated, modern metaphysics, with its use of a priori reasoning to draw conclusions about the nature of the world, can appear obsolete. It can appear to proceed as though we have learned nothing at all from Hume and Kant. But appearances here are misleading. Now, the reason she thinks that appearances are misleading here is because she thinks that, contrary to what lots of people think, metaphysics actually has a different subject matter from physics. Okay? Now, I might say that it's actually part of our whole spiel that metaphysics and science are different from one another in that they have different subject matters, but that they're nevertheless similar, right, in that they have broadly the same methodologies. Okay, now I think the first claim is false. I think the second claim is really weird, but I'm just gonna focus on the first claim today, right? The claim about subject matters. So why do they have different subject matters? Here's what she says: the ontological account, i.e., metaphysics, describes the metaphysically prior categories and constituents of the physically fundamental entities, and so describes features of the world that are more fundamental than those of natural science. For example, right, supposing that physics postulates fields and particles, the substrate attributes theorist, the metaphysician, might take fields and particles to be substances with properties, while the bundle theorist will take fields to be bundles of property intensities and location properties. Right? So they're going to tell us metaphysically what these things are, just that are described in science. Similarly, with properties, the ontological account will take the properties postulated by the scientific theory, such as charge, spin, and mass, and ask if they are fundamentally universals, or fundamentally tropes, or fundamentally something else. We see the same relationship between different theories of the construction of entities. An ontological theory of parts and wholes describes more fundamental and more general constructional principles than physics or chemistry does, for it gives general principles that govern all the physical objects with parts, including microparticles, atoms, and molecules. In these examples, the metaphysics gives the general and systematic story of what the categories are and what the method of composition is. The story from science is more specific. It just provides us with a list or a catalogue of entities that are the actual members of these categories. So metaphysics gives us the categories, while science just gives us the members of the categories, right? They're instances. Okay. So that's the claim. Metaphysics will tell us what objects, properties, and composition are qua categories. Science will just give us an inventory of specific instances without telling us what is general to them, what makes them all members of the category. Okay, so I'm going to claim is that if this is what metaphysicians are about, right, this is what metaphysics is supposed to do, then there's actually no reason to think that science needn't be an integral part, or engagement with science needn't be an essential sort of aspect of this project, at least if it's going to be an interesting one, right? And I should say, I'm really still working on this, but I'll give you the shape of my ideas here. So let's start off by thinking about the first category that she mentions, namely the category of objects, right? And let's think of some of the objects that have been postulated and perhaps in some cases, hopefully even discovered in physics. So the first sort of thing we might mention is the luminiferous ether, right? Which of course this now fictional mechanical medium pervading all of space. We also could mention the classical electromagnetic field, which is an undulating vector field defined on space-time points. And of course, these days we've also got the relativistic quantum field, which is, God knows what, something like a Lorentz invariant smorgasbord of probability functions governing the production of quasi-localized entities at points of space and time, right? Something like that. Now, as John Morrell famously said, right, the first two entities on this list are more like chalk and cheese than chalk and cheese themselves are, right? Like one being robustly mechanical, the other being seemingly very diaphanous. And the quantum field is, of course, just a totally other kettle of fish altogether again, right? Given that it has associated with it this probabilistic structure. So while I'll concede that the fact that we seem to want to count all of these things as objects in physics presumably means that we do recognize there to be such a thing as the category of objects, right? Something distinct from the category of properties, the category of composition relations, etc. It's nevertheless unclear to me how much we can usefully theorize about this thing. If to theorize about it is to say, on Paul's conception, what it is that is common to all of these members. Rather, since all these members seem to be so wildly different from one another, and here one wants to say metaphysically different from one another, it strikes me that any theory of the category in general would have to be correspondingly vague and non-committal in what it says, right? In order to say only true things about all of these very different members. Okay? So it's just not clear to me that a PhD is the sort of thing that you need in order to develop this theory. It seems very non-committal, it seems very vague in what it would be able to say. So to try and make this, I think the same point actually can be made a little bit clearer when we turn to the second category that she mentions, right? The category of properties. Right? Of course, one way of thinking about properties is in terms of universals, right? So she mentioned universals there. And if you look at what, say, Armstrong, who is a kind of leading authority on this stuff, what he has to say about universals, we find that he made some quite specific claims concerning universals. So one thing that Armstrong said about universals is that different determinate universals falling under a common determinable exclude one another in an object, whereas determinants drawn from different determinables may be freely recombined. Okay, so basic idea here is the following. Suppose I have an object, suppose it is blue, right? The fact that it has that determinate color means that it can have some other determinate color, right? So it can't be red, see. But the fact that it's blue means in and of it, like that in itself doesn't preclude it from being any determinate size, say, or any determinate shape, right? It could be any of those, they could be freely recombined. Now, well, for all I know, this works perfectly well as a metaphysics of sort of everyday objects. It seems pretty clear that at least some of that is going to have to go when we start thinking about properties in quantum mechanics. So suppose, for example, you buy into the kind of orthodox idea that a system has a property only if it's in an eigenstate of the relevant observable, then we know from complementarity that if I predicate a specific determinate property of an object, right, say given a specific determinate position, then right away I'm precluded from predicating a determinate feature of any, infinitely many other determinable properties, many other observables. So, for example, if I predicate a determinate position of an object, then right away I can't predicate of it a determinate momentum. Okay, so it seems like the second part of Armstrong's claim there seems to run into trouble. Now, if on the other hand you don't want to think about things that way, you want to sort of interpret superpositions as somehow saying that objects have what are normally called incompatible properties at the same time, right? So they have two different determinants of the same determinable at one and the same time. So say you interpret the two-slit experiment as somehow saying that the electron in some sense is here and it also is over there, then it seems that in that case it would be the first part of Armstrong's claim regarding universals that would have to go, right? It's not the case that different determinants of the same determinable exclude one another in an object anymore, at least not in any straightforward sense. So what we can see then is that, well, of course that's quantum mechanics, and it's what I said was quite naive and it's all very contentious. It really seems to be the case that there's going to be a problem in maintaining this a priori thesis about what properties are like in that context. Okay? So again, if we want to come up with a theory of properties in general, right, talk about the category of properties, it seems that whatever I say about properties, it has to be, true of if it's going to be true of all things in the category, then given that I have some properties in that category that have some metaphysical, interesting, substantial metaphysical features, but I also have some things in that category that completely contradict those features, it seems to me that there's in principle there's a limitation on what specific I can say about the category of properties if what I have to say has to be true of every single member of it. Okay? It's not clear that this is substantial, there's an interesting project here. And of course, we can say the same things about composition, right? There's lots and lots of ways for things to design in science, but I think the point by now will be as clear as it's going to get. So the bottom line, as far as I'm concerned, is that if the justification for disengaging metaphysics from science is that the former studies what all members of the thing that we want to call a category have in common with each other, then I just don't know how much useful mileage there is in this project. What would be a much more promising way, it seems to me, of saying something interesting about all of these very different instances of properties and objects that we find in physics, how they all relate to one another, would be by carefully tracing the connections that exist between their manifestations in their different theories of physics, carefully articulating the formal and empirical correspondences that allow me to say of an entity in one theory that it is the image of an entity in another. But while that would indeed allow us to forge relationships between entities in some general category, right, interesting relationships between entities in some general category, it's also clear that this is not an a priori project, right? This is a squarely naturalistic project. And indeed it's one that plenty of philosophers of science have been engaged in, right? Talk about how all these different concepts of properties and objects relate to one another. Okay? So I'm not impressed by Paul's rationale for divorcing metaphysics from science on the grounds that it's somehow more general. Right? To do this general project in an interesting way, it seems to me, means to do it in collaboration with physics. Okay, so that's what I want to say, and as I say, I'm still working on that, with regard to Laurie Halse's conception of what metaphysics is. I want to move on now to this idea, this quite fashionable idea at the moment, that what metaphysics is the science of the possible. Okay? So as I said, lots of people are buy into this. This has no doubt got a lot to do with David Lewis and his influence on the discipline. So here's A.J. Lowe, writing in 2012, metaphysics may be characterized as the science of the possible, charged with charting the domain of objective or real possibility. All metaphysics is implicitly modal because it is primarily concerned with kinds of things that are possible or compossible, and only subsequently with the kinds of things that are actual. Right? So this is him just a couple of years before he died, right? This is his sort of, after this long career in metaphysics, that's what he decided he'd been doing. Similarly, Connie and Sider make the same point when they say that metaphysics for them is about what could be and what must be. Except, incidentally, metaphysics is not about aspects of reality that are actual. Now, since presumably what the sciences study, right, we're stuck in the actual, scientists are stuck here in the actual world, so presumably what scientists study is actual, you can sort of infer from this that what they're saying here is that really the sciences have a kind of an incidental role, right, in metaphysics. It's only, science is something that you look at sort of subsequently, right, once you've done the work in metaphysics. Now what I want to claim is that if this is how you think about metaphysics, then once again, science is an absolutely central role to play within it. Okay? And I'm going to be quite dirty about how I argue this, partly because it's outlined in me and Steve's sort of recent paper where we give the same sort of argument. Okay. But here's the outlines of what it is I'm thinking. So let's suppose that metaphysics is the science of the possible. Okay, so then if I want to substantiate that and tell you what metaphysics is, what its subject matter is at the very least, then obviously I need to tell you something about what possibility is, right, which is a non-trivial matter. Or at least I need to give you some principles for identifying what sort of things are and are not possible. Okay? So I know what its subject matter is, the sort of thing that it studies. So really what we're looking for right away is going to be obvious in this conception anyway. What we're looking for, the most important thing in metaphysics to provide is going to be some kind of a theory of possibility. That's what we're looking for. Now if you go out and you look on the market at these various theories of possibility that are available, what you'll find is that by common consensus, it's David Lewis's framework of modal realism, his framework of possible worlds, that is typically regarded as the best theory of possibility that we have. Now the reason that David Lewis's theory is by and large regarded as our best theory of possibility, right, despite its sort of obvious sort of ontological excess, is because it really is the only theory of possibility that we have that gives us a reductive analysis of modality. Right? It's the only theory of possibility that we have that can give you a semantics for modal statements that don't themselves refer to any, they don't make reference to any modal concepts. Okay, so that's really quite an achievement. Now the reason that Lewis's theory of possibility has this feature is because it is based around the whole notion of possible worlds are based on a principle called the principle of recombination, right, which I'd say can be stated without any modal notions. And according to this principle of recombination, what happens is we start off with a big manifold, right, a manifold of objects with properties, and he says these are the perfectly natural properties, right, which is a primitive notion in the theory. And according to the principle of recombination, we can recombine these in a completely arbitrary way. So I can permute these objects among one another. I can add in new objects, perhaps with new properties. I can take objects out, take properties out. And I can do that in a completely unconstrained way. Okay? And according to him, every time that we do this, every time that we make a new combination, what we're doing is we're defining a new possible world. Okay? And it's these possible worlds that we're going to be using as semantic values to analyze modal discourse. Okay? So that's the principle that it's all predicated on. It's really at the heart of the system. Now, since these perfectly natural properties are there to build possible worlds, right, you have this world-building work to do, it's pretty clear that these have to be the fundamental properties, right? And he just makes that identification. Perfectly natural properties, fundamental properties. And since David Lewis is a physicalist, he believes that all the fundamental properties in this world, the actual world, are physical, right? So the fundamental properties in this world are the fundamental physics properties, right? But that's fine. Now, what's absolutely crucial to note is that these perfectly natural properties can be freely recombined with one another only if those properties are intrinsic properties. Right? I can't freely recombine extrinsic properties. I can't make a world, say, that contains nothing but a lone sister. Right? That's because it's an extrinsic property. It doesn't make any sense to have a world with no things than a lone sister, because being a sister has implications for other things that exist. Okay? Now, as I've said for David Lewis, the fundamental properties in this world, which are, of course, the only ones that we have any kind of access to, are the fundamental physics properties. So basically what Lewis does is he just stipulates that these properties have that feature of being intrinsic. But of course you can't simply stipulate with a fundamental physics property that it has some nice metaphysical feature that suits your purposes, right? You have to look into the theory and check whether they really can be said to have that feature. And what I would argue is that these reasons to think that fundamental properties, at least as we understand them at the moment, don't in general have that feature. Now, I should say that the first time that we argued this, right, in our first paper, we sort of screwed it up. We made an argument based on the gauge principle, but there was a whole article in the next edition of the journal showing in pitiless detail how we bagged the question, and it all went wrong. But I think that nevertheless, we have a new argument, right? A better argument for it in this cause. The way that I'd argue this is by by insisting that if you want to understand what the fundamental physics properties are like, then you have to look at them in our most fundamental theories. And at the moment, like in our lumpet, that theory is quantum, or framework at least for theories, is quantum field theory. Now it turns out that in quantum field theory, to say that a property is fundamental is to make a quite specific predication of it. It's to say that that property remains well-defined, right? That property of an object remains well-defined regardless of how high the energy scales are. Okay, so equivalently, what you're saying is, no matter how small the distances in space that I look, when I find objects with that property, they always have some finite value with it, right? It's always well-defined in that sense. Okay? So it's quite a sort of, it's a mathematically sort of understood notion. Now it turns out that whether any property of an object in quantum field theory, right, so whether any property of a field has that feature, right, of being fundamental, is a function of what other fields you have in the theory. Okay, so that's just in general the case. So for example, for the sort of subset of you in here that are familiar with this stuff, you might know that the beta function governing the evolution of charge under the color charge under the renormalization group flow, which is just telling you how color behaves as you ramp up the energy, that is a function of how many flavors of quarks it is that you have in the theory. Okay. With the result that color qualifies as a fundamental property and QCD is a fundamental theory only if there are 60 or fewer flavors of quark in the theory. So it seems then that the very fundamentality of a property of an object in quantum field theory isn't a feature that is independent of accompaniment, right? It isn't a feature that doesn't depend on what else occupies the same world as the thing with the property you were thinking about, which is a way of saying that it's not intrinsic. Right? Fundamentality does not seem to be an intrinsic feature of the property. So it strikes me that if we can't say it strikes me that if the fundamentality of a fundamental physics property is not an intrinsic feature of it, then we can't say that the fundamental physics properties are intrinsic, right? It's just not the case that I can postulate some manifold of objects with properties and say that they're fundamental properties, and then just help myself to adding in new objects and taking objects away, and still know a priori that what I'm dealing with are fundamental properties. So it seems to me that it seems to do a lot of damage. Right? It seems to sort of refute the postulates that David Lewis makes and indeed needs to make for his theory, right, to be a viable theory of possibility. So what we see from this then is that even if metaphysics is the science of the possible, then it's not the case that it can afford to ignore physics. Right? It's not the case that physics just has some incidental role. Because what we can see is that paying attention to physics can show that the principles that actually lie at the heart of our theories of possibility can be false, right? It can refute them. And therefore it seems that we can use physics to actually, since we can use physics to falsify those theories that lie at the very heart of our theories of possibility, then presumably we can use physics to actually refute on this conception, our broad conception of metaphysics itself, right? If metaphysics is the science of the possible in this way. So the bottom line here is that there's nothing in either of these conceptions of metaphysics by some big sort of hitters in the discipline that disabuses me of my sort of prior belief, right, as a naturalist, as a second philosopher, that science really does lie at the heart of metaphysics. On the contrary, it seems to me that to do it correctly and to do it interestingly means to do it in close contact with physics. All right. So that's how I would argue these days for that first part of the clip. So it goes beyond mere naturalistic table talking. We've looked at how metaphysicians themselves conceive of the discipline and argued that if, in their own terms, that science, it seems, needs to lie at the heart of it. But it seems that we're speaking at quite a high level of abstraction here, right? Somehow we're speaking about metaphysics as a whole, like as a discipline, right? Whatever it is that means. But of course, what is true for the whole need not be true of all the parts. So it doesn't seemingly follow from anything that I've said so far that there are no projects that we might want to engage in metaphysics that can be contributed to science in some really sort of valuable or central way. Okay? And indeed, what I want to argue now is that there are indeed debates that we're having in the philosophy of physics that seem to rely on precisely the same sorts of a priori sort of methods of reasoning that analytic metaphysicians are getting it in the net form, right? And to which science, it seems, cannot make any kind of meaningful contribution. Okay. And what I want to use just briefly, right, is to look at some themes concerning the debates that we have in philosophy of physics over fundamentality issues. Although presumably there's many other things that we could have cited, this is the one I'm going to talk about, most obviously because this is what I did my PhD on, and I haven't got a lot of choice in the matter. But it's also, sadly, it's also the case that this really is sort of a nice example for these purposes, because fundamentality is an issue that lots and lots of parties in this debate actually are interested in. So, for example, fundamentality is a really, really big topic in metaphysics just now. There's all this literature on priority and grounding and so on and so forth. But it's also very much subject of dispute in the philosophy of physics. So this is why it was nice that Anjan sort of presaged what I was going to say by talking about ontic structural realism. Because as we'll see, ontic structuralism is a fundamentality thesis. Okay, we'll see that in a moment. But actually it's quite interesting because fundamentality is an issue, a metaphysical issue, that sometimes scientists themselves sort of get interested, get kind of immersed in debates about. And this is something that you actually could be seen quite explicitly in the 60s and the 70s and then again in the 1990s, when there were these debates between condensed matter physicists and high energy physicists over whether or not they should build a superconducting super collider, right, in the US. And there were all these congressional debates, and you could see there that fundamentality considerations were actually used to define a sort of prestige politics that was quite instrumental in determining who did and didn't get federal funding. And it's quite an interesting story that other people have written about. Okay, so let's think a little bit about fundamentality and how we engage in these sort of debates in the philosophy of physics when we're thinking about it and arguing about fundamentality. So the central question in any metaphysics of fundamentality is what the hell it means to call something fundamental, right? Or what it means to call something more fundamental than something else. Now, while I would say that sort of the literature on this issue is in large part kind of a bit of a mess, and people use all sorts of different characterizations of fundamentality that are, non-coextensive but often treated interchangeably, and there's lots of problems in the literature. But one thing that we can say is that at least until recently, a very popular way, at the very least, of analysing fundamentality is through some kind of notion of existential necessitation, right, or existential entailment, or supervenience, right, however you want to put it. The basic idea is the following. So typically people analyse the idea that X is more fundamental than Y by saying that necessarily the very existence of X entails the existence of Y. Okay, so in this kind of literature, it's quite common to use this E as this sort of existence predicate, and this box here symbolises some kind of necessity. Okay, and metaphysicians usually are interested in metaphysical necessity. Since I don't really know what that is, I tend to think of it in terms of physical necessity in some sense. So that's how I would understand it. Okay. Now the basic idea here is, right, if your fundamental thing exists, then you don't have to do anything else for the non-fundamental thing to exist. Okay, it's kind of like an ontological free lunch. It just comes along for the ride. Okay, so when Lewis characterizes the fundamental level of the world by saying, by a set of perfectly natural properties, you've done everything you need to do to bring everything else into existence, he's using this kind of a notion. When ontic structural realists, on the other hand, say that quantum entanglement relations are fundamental, what they're saying is, it's not, the reason they say that is because it's not the case that by settling the existence of your quantum particles, their state-independent properties, their dispositional properties, you've done enough to determine what entanglement relation between them is going to exist. Okay, so lots of parties are thinking about fundamentality in this way. So what we can see here is that this analysis is purely model, right, concerning as it does just patterns of coexistence across different possible worlds. Now, but metaphysicians, analytic metaphysicians, are increasingly of the view that this kind of modal analysis that we've been using for so long is actually too coarse-grained to do the work that we need it to do. Okay, and this is why there's now this sort of mushrooming literature on the notion of grounding. Okay, which is a bit of an unknown quantity at this point, but the basic idea is supposed to be that grounding is this relation that will fill in the details, right? It's more fine-grained somehow. Now, I should say that philosophers of science typically have not been very impressed by all this literature on grounding. They think it's a bit of a storm in a teacup a lot of the time. But what I would say is that there definitely are philosophers of science who need some kind of a stronger notion, right, for whom this analysis is not adequate. And what I would say is that ontic structural realists are exactly one set of philosophers of science who need there to be some stronger analysis. So why is this? Well, as I've said, ontic structural realism, right, is a fundamentality thesis. Okay? It's the claim, in Lederman and Rossi's words, that relational structure is ontologically fundamental and objects are not, right? So it is explicitly a fundamentality thesis. So they defend various sort of specializations of this claim. They defend the idea, as I mentioned, that entanglement relations are fundamental, and for them more fundamental than quantum particles. They defend the sort of relationalism about space-time, according to which spatio-temporal relations are more fundamental than space-time points. They defended the view that gauge symmetries are more fundamental than gauge bosons, and they defended the idea that laws of nature are more fundamental than little objects with dispositions running around them, right? So they tend to not like dispositional essentialism. So it's a thesis that these structures are ontologically fundamental and that objects are not. Now, what I would say, so is that if these are the claims, which they are, right, that structural realists want to defend, then they need a more fine-grained analysis of fundamentality. And there's two main reasons I'll cite, right, to show you that that's the case. So the first reason is that if you have a purely modal analysis of relative fundamentality, then it's going to turn out so that a priori, nothing that is necessary can be ontologically fundamental. Okay? So the reason for this is easy to see. So suppose that Y here is some necessary existent, right? Let's again think about indexing this to different physically possible worlds. Then it's going to hold, right? Because it's going to hold in every single world that the constant right here is true. Therefore, the whole thing is true. Therefore, that physically necessary thing is in this sort of ontological free lunch position and can't be fundamental. Okay, so that just follows right away. But if you think about what sort of things we think of as being physically sort of necessary, then the obvious candidate to cite here is laws, right? Laws of nature. So it's the fact that, although I think actually we do a slightly more general analysis, but typically it's the fact that different possible worlds all share the same laws of nature, namely actual ones, that makes them physically possible in the first place, right? So the laws of nature are physically necessary, right, in this way. So if you have this analysis, laws of nature can never be fundamental, but as we've seen for ontic structuralists, they are fundamental, right? So structuralism is just false on its view. Another reason why this analysis doesn't work, and I sort of gestured at this when I was replying to asking Anyan after his talk, it follows from this analysis, this modal analysis, that two things that necessarily coexist with one another can never be more or less fundamental than each other, right? If on this view, fundamentality is analysed in terms of just mere patterns of existence, so if two things always exist in the same possible world, you can't say that one's more fundamental. But of course, that's another thing that structuralists deny. So as we were saying, right, structuralists do think that whenever you get space-time points, they by definition stand in relations, but relations by definition relate the latter. And they still want to say that it's the relations that are more fundamental than the points, right? But they can't say this on this view. So the bottom line here is that a purely modal analysis such as this of fundamentality is going to render structuralism false. Okay? So should we say at this point that ontic structuralism is false? Well, would you believe structural realists don't think that? Right? What structural realists do is interpret this situation as basically a modus tollens of the idea that this coarse-grained, purely modal analysis of fundamentality was indeed the right way to think about fundamentality. Right? So this is why they're trying to get behind this literature on grounding and go for a more fine-grained conception. Now, of course, not everybody agrees on this. Humanities, on the other hand, for example, think everything's just fine here. They like purely modal analyses. They like the idea that laws aren't fundamental, right? Everything's working just fine if you're a Humean at this point. Okay. So, who is right here, should we say? Right? Is this the right way to analyze relative fundamentality or not? Okay. What we can see is that whole factional disputes in the philosophy of science are going to rest on whether this is or isn't the right way to think about fundamentality. So, how are we going to figure it out? Well, the first thing to say here is that what seems clear is that science, right, at least untrusted metaphysical interpretation, can't really be of any help here. Right? What unvarnished scientific theory presumably does is give us a mathematical description of objects and properties, right, evolving in accordance with their associated laws. It does not in any straightforward sense identify for us what it is that's more or less fundamental within that description. Right? If it did that, we wouldn't have to go through this whole argument. Now, as we've seen, even though science doesn't seem to straightforwardly identify what's fundamental to us, there are parties in this debate that nevertheless think that within that formalism, more and less fundamental things can be identified. Now, of course, we can't identify what the fundamental things in that formalism are until we know what the signature of the fundamental is. But what that feature is that signals fundamentality is exactly the thing that the analysis was supposed to provide us with. Right? So it seems that there's no straightforward sense in which we can just look to science for the answer here. And indeed, it seems that at this point, we find ourselves facing squarely what is known as the paradox of analysis. On the one hand, we can't know whether we've got an analysis of fundamentality right, or at least even extensionally adequate, until we know what is in fact fundamental. On the other hand, we can't know what is fundamental until we know what the mark of the fundamental is, which is exactly the thing that the analysis is supposed to provide. So in the first case, we can know whether we got the analysis right, but that's exactly when we don't need it. On the other hand, in the second case, we need the analysis, but we'll never know that we got it right. So this is often thought to be the fundamental problem of analytic philosophy, right? And it goes all the way back to Plato, right? I believe somewhere in the middle. Okay? So a couple of millennia on, here we are doing philosophy of particle physics, right? We're just facing the same old problem yet again. So where do we go from here, right? How are we supposed to think about fundamentality? How are we supposed to resolve this issue? Well, typically the way of resolving the paradox of analysis is via the deployment of the method of coming to what is called reflective equilibrium. So this term here is from Rawls, I believe, but the basic idea, at least in its modern incarnation, I think goes back to Goodman. So while it's not easy to say what this is, the general idea is that the analysis that we should arrive at is one that somehow represents the best compromise between competing considerations. So on the one hand, the analysis should be one that preserves significant chunks of extant deployment of the concept and any non-negotiable pre-theoretic intuitions that we might have about it. Otherwise, we have no grounds for thinking that we're actually analysing the concept that we're looking for. But on the other hand, we should of course be willing to give up at least some of our intuitions on the matter as a result of broader theoretical concerns. Otherwise, we just have learned nothing from the analysis at all. Okay, so somehow it's all about hitting the sweet spot. Right, now you can probably guess I'm actually kind of fluffing this a bit. I don't really know what the method of reflective equilibrium is. I don't really know what it involves. I don't really know what Rawls said about it. But it strikes me that if there is one thing that is clear about the method of arriving at reflective equilibrium, it's that prior intuitions about fundamentality are going to play an indispensable role in anyone's claims about how it is that we should analyse it. Right? It is, after all, the structuralist intuitions that laws are fundamental that has caused them to reject the modal analysis of fundamentality that they started with. And of course, it's really not clear on what other grounds they could reject that analysis, but appeal to their intuitions, because of course, we don't have any theory at this point. That's the thing that we're looking for. The problem, of course, is that different parties in this debate have different such intuitions. Like, for example, humanists have totally different intuitions, and that's the basic dialectic that got us thinking about this problem in the first place. Okay? So by thinking about fundamentality, I think we can see that if we really interrogate some of the concepts that we're using as philosophers of physics, right, really get down to brass tacks and how it is that we understand them, we sort of expose the fact that there are some key concepts we're working with that science can't justify our theories of, and in which intuitions instead have some essential justificatory role to play. But as I said at the beginning, those are some of the criticisms that Lakeman and Co. had with analytic metaphysics. So to be clear here, right, I'm not saying by any means that there is nothing about the metaphysics of fundamentality that science can help us with. So for example, Jonathan Schaffer, in a sort of important survey paper on what grounds what, basically makes some a priori stipulations about relations of relative fundamentality, right, or ontological priority, and amongst those things he asserts that these relations are form partial orders, right, so they're irreflexive, asymmetric, and transitive, and that moreover they are well-founded, right, so that they will exist fundamental things. And he just asserts these things a priori, what ontological priority, what features ontological priority has. Now what I hope I've shown, at least in some of my own work, and of course other people have done this as well, is that once you've actually settled on a way of understanding priority, you can use science to subvert plenty of those assumptions, right? So for example, you can cite examples from science that will show that ontological priority can in some cases be a sort of symmetric relation. You can cite examples from science that at least suggest that it makes sense to think that it might be turtles all the way down, that there might not be a fundamental level. So it seems that, once we've decided on how it is that we understand priority, we can subvert all sorts of sort of a priori kind of postulates and features of it, and we can use science to do so. But nevertheless, it seems that the core of the concept seems to be empirically isolated, right? And that presumably is an important fact about naturalistic metaphysics. So basically that's where I'm going to leave it. As I say, I'm not going to try and draw any very general conclusions from this, but what I do hope to have shown is that lots of parties in this debate are coming at the issue from crude defensive positions, right? And I think that in lots of cases we need a more nuanced account, and that it's natural that as metaphysicians of science that we need a slightly more patient analysis of how we do things, and I want this a little bit more honest about the kinds of reasoning that we seem to be that seem to be indispensable to us, and maybe have a better appreciation of that fact before we start lashing out at analytic metaphysicians.
Thanks for the discussion anyway, into the lion's den. Good for you. There were 2 points I want to make that are kind of related that had to do with your way of presenting Laurie's view, and then later when you're talking about Schaffer and the a priori stipulations about fundamentality. Before I talk about that, I just want to say to metaphysicians of science, philosophers of science, nobody thinks, nobody thinks that a modal notion suffices for getting at an appropriate understanding of nothing over above. It's been like decades since, even the strongest modal supervenience or whatever is not sufficient to the task of gaining nothing over aboveness. I can talk about that, but what I just want to say is that the choice isn't supervenience or a kind of primitivist a prioristic notion of grounding, right? There's, metaphysicians of science in particular have been exploring all these very precise relations of dependence, including determinable-determinant relation, proper subset, hardhood, functional realization, blah, 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 right? So, just wanted to advertise that so that if anyone is thinking those are your only 2 choices, Schaffer and others are really, really wrong about that. Part of the problem of Schaffer and others who are saying, oh yeah, here's how we should understand these metaphysical dependence relations or relatedly fundamentality in terms of a single notion of grounding, and then they offer you these formal features of it which are easily controverted just like you did. There's a supposition that there has to be just this one way for metaphysical dependence to proceed in particular. But that doesn't seem right. There can be many different ways in which some entities might depend on some more, broadly speaking, fundamental entities and so on. And similarly with Laurie's view, it seems like you want to say a problem for her conception where metaphysical theory, what metaphysicians do is like the target is different, it's more general, we're looking for the most abstract categories of reality. And then you pointed out a very interesting objection to that, which is that, well, how are you going to get anything very substantive about these general categories given the great range of variation about scientific and other reality? I think that, first of all, it needn't be that qua metaphysicians we have to always be looking for just sort of the one thing that's in common among everything, right? We can just be looking for more abstract characterizations of a multiple of different ways in which reality might be. And the other thing is that I think, another way of understanding what she's suggesting, which I think is supported by some of the text in her article, is that she wants to say what we're doing is in a way an abstraction from what the scientists are doing, so that you know, we want to look at the science. We want to say, okay, all right, field theory. If that's if it looks like field theory is right, we want our, you know, our metaphysical categories to perhaps, well, they have to accommodate that one way or another, right? I just wasn't sure what exactly the complaint was going to be towards her conception of theorizing. I don't think I think she wants her metaphysics to be scientifically informed, and she thinks that, she says that metaphysical theories have been disconfirmed by scientific theorizing. For example, about space and time, similarly with your point about Armstrong's theories of universals. It turns out that, you know, same determinants of a single determinable can coexist, and, you know, that so much for his theory, right? So that's the sort of theory or understanding of physics I thought she would find out.
Okay, yeah, sure. No, absolutely. So, for the start, I think her paper is incoherent. I think she's trying to have things both ways.
Oh, okay.
Right. But in terms of, I mean, if the claim that she was making was just like metaphysicians are engaged in something, they're trying to do something a bit more abstract, right? Abstract is not the same thing as general. Right? She's trying to do something that is more abstract than what physicists are doing, then that's absolutely fine. But what she claims is that she's using that to this supposed sort of generality or abstractness of metaphysics to say that it can be done in an a priori fashion. Right? And that I completely deny. So I'm absolutely think it's right that saying if you have a quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, then it's there for metaphysicians to give a more kind of abstract, if not possible, sort of description of what it is that's going on. And but it only makes sense as a sort of a posteriori project when I'm starting off with scientific theories, and then I'm going to come up with conceptions of what objects are like that are sort of specific to those ontologies that we find there and that are informed by it. Right? It's the claim that she's making that this can proceed in an a priori. So we're talking about metaphysics as an a priori discipline.
But I don't think she does.
No, but she does even in the quotes at the beginning. Right? She talks about a priori metaphysics.
She says she doesn't really think that, she said sometimes I think it's that there's this big divide between science and metaphysics, but really I think they're in fact exchanging into each other, and that, you know, there is also science informed metaphysics and vice versa. So I don't think she thinks that metaphysics is...
Well, there's certainly, like I said, I don't think the paper is coherent. But there are certainly, I think even in the quotes that I sort of gave you, she's defending an a priori, like metaphysics as an a priori discipline that has a different subject matter. Right?
Different subject matter, that's different for different methodologies.
But what she's also, yes, I know what she does say, that she's trying to defend a role for this kind of a priori sort of metaphysics. And, you know, what she seems to be, the way that she's talking is that, so she says, she gives her example of like interpreting fields in quantum field theory, and then she gives you the bundle theory, she gives you substrate attribute, which lo and behold are exactly the same sort of metaphysical theories that you teach the first years when you're talking about tables and chairs. Yeah. Right? So she seems to be operating with this idea that those metaphysical conceptions that are applying in classical domain, it's just a priori that they would also apply in quantum field theory, and it's just entirely unclear to me that they would for the reasons that I said. Okay, so I mean, I was a little bit sort of hesitant about presenting Laurie Halse's paper because I mean, sometimes I think there are certain things you should just let them lie. And I think maybe if it was better developed, right, it would sort of be worth coming back to. But the point I was wanting to make that if this idea that metaphysics is something more general, which I would say is not the same thing as more abstract, then that isn't a good.
A general in a way that's supposed to be a priori.
General in that it's supposed to apply to everything. It's supposed to apply to all objects, all properties, all members of the category. That doesn't make any sense. Abstract is different. Right, so we can have classical ontology, we can have quantum ontology, we can have abstract descriptions of each, and they can be completely different. Right? As for your first point about how it is that so nobody in metaphysics is working with this sort of pure modal conception.
Well, not nobody, but many people don't.
Right, sure, yeah. So yeah, but there are so a few things to say about that. So one of them is that there is some nice work being done trying to. So I should say that I don't think that Kip finds notion of ontological dependence is a relation of ontological priority, but lots of people think it is. But there's certainly a lot of work to try and save what's called like Nathan Wellman did this lovely stuff of trying to save the modal analysis of S's by making it fields of perfectly natural properties. It's going to block some of the counterexamples. Right. And I think I'm quite interested in thinking about whether, so think about, when you think about Mill's methods, when you're thinking about causation, you have these modal correlations, and then you invite yourself to use background knowledge to sort of and relevance considerations to sort of cut things out, and we've seen whether you can do that in the fundamentality context as well. So there are some people in metaphysics who think that it's worth trying to save these sort of modal notions. But what I would say that in philosophy of physics, so some of the cases that you mentioned about set membership or part-whole relations and things like that, again, these seem to be notions that it's not clear how much sort of traction they can have in sort of non-classical sort of context. So it's not so surprising that they don't look at all that. It's like what's in Karen Bennett's got this long paper sort of building up the world, and it's all really nice, but it's very, very classical. So it's not clear that any of these relations are the relations that you need to talk about in relationships between particles, create irreducible representations, and semi-simple Liebers. That's sort of not clear. So it's not clear how much of those tools are applicable in the philosophy of physics. What I would say, though, in the philosophy of physics, people's understanding of ontological priority is really kind of primordial, right? It's very underdeveloped, and this was actually Hawley's objection to Ladyman and Ross. You're making this big fundamentality thesis, and at no point did you ever tell us what fundamentality was supposed to mean, except in convenience terms. Right. So in some sense, I'm speaking to philosophers of physics in it, but it's not the case that you can just look at metaphysics and think the problems will be solved, because they're just directed to different problems. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Kerry. I'm really sympathetic to what you're doing. I could have guessed that. But I want to ask you about the people who want to defend the idea that metaphysics or analytic metaphysics is autonomous in a way, is doing something different. And not because I disagree with what you want to say, but just because I think the conversation there is more complicated, perhaps, than we might have gotten a sense of from your talk. And I think it's important for people like you and me and others to recognize that it's more complicated and engage with them in ways that go beyond what you said, for example, about Paul. So, one reason you might suggest that it's an autonomous discipline is to say, look, you want us to start with our best science, that's all well and good, but here's the pessimistic induction, right? So Worrell's talking about chalk and cheese and then super chalk and super cheese, right? Mm-hmm. And so this kind of, I think there's a place where David Lewis says, yeah, is my system falsified by quantum mechanics? Yeah, maybe, but quantum mechanics is a big conceptual mess, so once you get that straightened out, come back to me and then we'll see, right? So, there's a worry that because of the pessimistic induction, and until and unless we engage with that in some meaningful way, the advice to just start from our best science doesn't obviate the idea that there might be an autonomous discipline here that should do its stuff, because it doesn't know what the best science is to start from, which to do the true, the correct, whatever metaphysics, right? Now, one might respond to that, and various people have, by saying, here's my solution to the pessimistic induction, right? But interestingly, I think what happens when people say, here's my way of talking about, stability throughout scientific revolutions or whatever, etc., they end up importing a lot of metaphysics. So multi-structuralists do it one way, and other people do it other ways. Some people do it in neo-Aristotelian ways. And there it looks like we're borrowing from the toolbox. And again, you might suggest, well, here's an autonomous discipline that we need to supply us with tools, right? So I don't want to disagree with what you're saying. I just want to say that I think the dialectic is more complicated in virtue of the fact that we don't know where our best science is.
Okay, true. So you think you can't write a pessimistic Bennett induction when it comes to metaphysics?
Who requires that success?
Yeah, if you have a notion of success, then you
yes and no. Certainly you can. I don't think that changes the point I'm making, or reduces the effectiveness of the point I'm making. But here's a sense in which I think you can, right? Which is that in metaphysics, to a large extent, there have been views that have been ruled out of court, but there's a sense in which, like a lot of other areas of philosophy, a lot of views are still in court, right? In a way that just isn't true in the sciences, because we ruled a lot of views out in the sciences, and we have a current best conception that seems to be inconsistent with everything that followed. And you don't find scientific communities that say, oh yeah, no, I still really champion Aristotelian physics, or I still really champion Cartesian physics, right? That's just an analogy from what's going on.
Maybe, but I guess maybe this goes back to the sort of the generality. For example, I think these debates have been substantists will talk about laws of nature, like, we should have this relation between the universals view or the Humean view. I think that actually that debate is completely out of date as well, personally. I think that debate doesn't make any sense in fundamental physics, so I'm just not convinced that there are all these examples of substantive metaphysical claims that can be just completely, that are completely immune to scientific change.
Well, you can stipulate that, but...
No, I'm not stipulating it. No, I just have an argument that these debates make no sense in quantum field theory context, right? And that is supposed to be the premier example of this sort of metaphysical debates that we get in philosophy of science, right? And I think that it doesn't have any implication at this level, right? So it's not just stipulating it. The other thing I wanted to say, I mean, in terms of sort of naturalism, like, oh, we don't know what science is going to do. There might be another revolution, therefore what's the point in tying our metaphysics too closely to current science? Well, why don't you say to the physicists, why do you bother doing this? It might all be wrong. Totally the same, it's completely analogous claim. Naturalism enjoys us, like, there is no view from nowhere, right? We have to start with the best science of our day. That is what naturalism enjoys us to do. And so, that's what I do.
And I think that's perfectly fine. It's just that some of the people you're talking to aren't naturalists in that sense.
Okay, I know, but that's why I also tried to use metaphysicians' own conception of what they were doing to argue that actually they need to put metaphysics back in the heart of physics. It wasn't just naturalistic table thumping. Sean?
Yes, I mean, well, to the extent that I understand what metaphysics is, which is not clear, I'm entirely sympathetic to your criticism of doing it outside of science, but I don't think you appreciate the difficulty that there is in grounding metaphysics in a physics which denies having any ontology. In particular...
What do you mean this last part, that denies having any ontology?
Well, that's organic quantum mechanics. You see, ultimately, all your explanatory arrows go down to quantum mechanics, and then when you go to quantum mechanics, they say there's nothing but predictions of results of measurement. I know, wait, that's what they say. I mean, it's true that they say two things. What?
Who's they?
The physicists. Any honest textbook about physics tells about results of measurement and mechanics. Of course, it's true that in colloquial language they say other things, but, you know, honestly, their formalism, again, if you heard well, probably, maybe you didn't absorb the talk, but the talk I gave is that really, you know, ordinary quantum mechanics does not say, as you say, that the position of the particle is localized somewhere, then the momentum is spread out. The point is that if you measure position, then subsequently you get a wave function which spread for a further measurement of momentum. But you see, you should never forget that for the physicist, the measurement creates the result, or at least influences the result, or maybe perturbs the result. And the only thing we're allowed to talk about are results of measurement. In particular, I take issue with the fact that you speak of quantum field theory as being a theory about quantum fields. There is no, of course, there are various predictions and they're remarkably successful, etc. But there, when you really talk to the physicists, the ontology of their theory, they have pictures and the Feynman diagram and they take them literally, etc. But they can't take them literally on the basis of their own theory, which assumes that there is just a quantum state, and the quantum state is uninterpretable in terms of real event unless you go towards bone theory or general. Yes, but if you don't do that,
have an interpretation.
Sorry?
Unless you have an interpretation, yes. But then
but it's not just an interpretation, because I don't think it's an alternative theory, because the usual theory is uninterpretability. And that's why, of course, you may not agree with me that that's a big debate about quantum mechanics, but I wanted to make that point that, you know, although I completely agree with the response you gave to the previous question, you know that we should use the best science, I can also understand the remark of Lewis, which I heard quoted, saying that's a big mess, so let's forget about it. I don't think that's a good answer.
Right.
I think you have to deal with it, but then you have to deal with the fact that it's a big mess, and you can't found your metaphysics on a physics which is refusing to have an ontology.
Okay, sure. So, I mean, when you say that there's no ontology, I mean, I just want to refer to Tim's talk, like, one should try and find that ontology?
Yeah, we should try to find it.
Yeah.
But of course, trying to find it is a big project which goes outside conventional physics. So if you speak to a metaphysician, you can say, okay, go look into a standard quantum mechanics books, and then he goes and he really looks carefully to it. Then he says, but there is no ontology. And then he comes home and he says, how am I going to do my metaphysics based on something which is That's the problem.
Right, okay, so I mean, when I'm talking about quantum mechanics and we should engage with it, of course you're going to have to, right? If you're going to do a metaphysical project with it, then of course one has to commit to some kind of interpretation, or at least discuss what the interpretive options are, right? You're not just talking about marks on paper or measurements or something like that. But what I also mean, in terms of the Lewis quote, this is something that I really, really, really don't like about how metaphysicians respond to, I mean, so I think everybody we need to be quite forgiving of each other. Like, metaphysics of physics is really hard. Interpreting quantum mechanics is hard, right? It's very, very difficult. If you haven't done advanced levels of advanced degrees in science, it's very, very hard to make any kind of contributions here, right? In my own work, I'm always constantly looking for ways to lower the bar, right? What is the minimum amount of technical stuff that I need to learn in order to make this come? It's so difficult. But on the other hand, this thing that you often find metaphysicians doing is like, well, so take the Lewis quote, quantum mechanics is a mess, therefore I'm not going to kind of engage with that. I'm going to do this other thing, right? The idea that by doing that other thing, you are not committing yourself to some substantive physical principles, right? It just isn't right. So, for example, you see this in the debate over laws of nature, right? Where laws are always considered to be these sort of functional relationships between properties, right? So it's always Coulomb's law or Newton's law of gravitation or so on and so forth. There's this idea that by debating, having a metaphysical debate over these things, you're somehow doing something that's really quite general. Right? So you don't have to engage with the details of the quantum physics, you're doing something that's a bit more general. No, it's not. What you are doing is giving a metaphysics of classical physics.
Yes.
Right? So don't think it's a more general project, you're just giving a metaphysics of classical physics. So don't think that you're not doing that somehow, you don't want to kind of engage with science, right? Because that's sort of too hard and it's not settled. What you were doing is you were giving me a metaphysics of classical physics, right? And people shouldn't be mistaken about that. Yeah. Carl.
So it's kind of a follow-up to the last couple of questions, but people can push back against your claims by pointing out the difficulties of quantum mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a suspicion, I haven't been able to think this through during the question period, but I have a suspicion that you could provide good counterexamples to most of these metaphysical principles and things just using biology and maybe, or maybe chemistry.
Yeah.
And that might be a useful supplement to people who want to dismiss what you're saying. Well, figure out the quantum mechanics, then come back to me. Well, no, how about biology?
Yeah. Okay, no, I think that's really interesting. So actually, I'd like to hear what, so you've obviously had some scientists that were intuition of what these examples would be, and I think we'd like to hear about them. I'm quite interested in sort of this idea, we seem to have this idea that if you're doing sort of good metaphysics, or metaphysics that should be taken seriously, you should be doing the metaphysics at the fundamental level. And you can see that in the quotes from sort of Laurie Halse, that's generally and like I also mentioned, like what metaphysicians these days seem to be striving for. Which is why, of course, there is this whole problem of the disengagement from physics, right? If you were just doing Strassonian descriptive methods, it wouldn't matter a bit that you didn't engage with quantum mechanics, right? But it's I'm not going to really answer that question, but I think it's worth thinking about. So in philosophy of physics, there's this whole movement to be more kind of generous in one's ontology, in that this stupid idea that people used to have that the only things that are really real are the fundamental things in some way, that we shouldn't verify tables and chairs, and not stupid, but problematic idea. Shouldn't verify tables and chairs and things that seem to be that are not fundamental. There's this, partly because of the discussions around effective field theory and so on, David Wallace's work about understanding higher order ontology, decoherence, based sort of metaphysics and quantum mechanics. People are much more happy to, and also, Daniel Dennett, I guess, is a huge sort of figure in this as well, like reifying non-fundamental ontology as the subject matter of the special sciences. So it seems that we're quite willing to reify non-fundamental, higher order, ontology, but actually I think it's not obvious that there can be a non-problematic metaphysical project associated with non-fundamental ontology. It would take me quite a while to sort of spell that out. It's something that me and Wayne have been talking about actually. So sometimes I think with metaphysicians you do, sadly, have to look at more fundamental regimes, which are sadly the regimes that we understand most poorly. And presumably there's information in that as well.
But of course, if the goal was to give the most general account of objecthood, and you would want to have tables and chairs and species and viruses and things like that being objects, then they're committed to doing it at that level too. And maybe you have an argument to say give up on that in general, but and also thinking of the fundamentality axiom that you had there, was really a definition or a proposal for how to analyze more fundamental than.
Yes.
And those kind of relations surely go up the hierarchy.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, well, it's the time we're supposed to stop, so thank you very much.